For more on President Putin's proposed social and infrastructure spending plans in his annual address, I'm joined by Anton Fedyashin. He's an associate professor of history at American University here in Washington, D.C. Welcome back.
Good to be here, Rachelle.
So let's start with the main economic themes that came out of this speech. What were the real standouts for you?
The main thing was two things, I guess. One is that Putin laid out a very ambitious plan, but he didn't explain how he was going to pay for it, and that's very important. Number two, he did demonstrate visually, which is why the address was moved to a different building from the Kremlin, which is a new twist. He did show statistics where he demonstrated that over the past 18 years, compared to the figures of 2000, 2001, the Russian population really has benefited economically. The poverty rate has been halved. He showed figures regarding inflation, which is at historic lows right now. So macroeconomically, things look good. And this speech was ultimately intended to be his campaign Trump's stump speech, the first one in the opening, and the election is on the 18th of March. He seems like he pulled it off.
And to that point, we know that usually this speech is kind of to lay out that roadmap for the future of Russia.
Right.
But with these elections coming up in just a few weeks, how much did that shape and change the tone of his speech?
You know what? Not by much, because what we heard today is what he's been saying fairly consistently over the past 4 years for sure, since the Ukraine crisis has broken out. Economically, there was nothing new, and the emphasis was that Russia's economic problems are of her own making and will only be solved by Russia. There was no blaming of the West or any conspiracies in terms of domestic issues. And that, again, has been a consistent point of Vladimir Putin. So look to your own strengths. And strangely, the Western sanctions have actually helped the Russians, while also hurting them, in nationalizing their elite and turning internal Russian money towards investment in their own economy.
So then what impact have sanctions had in the negative? We know that we're seeing a lot more Russians depending on the local economy, a lot more entrepreneurship. Have there been any negative impacts?
Definitely, because overall, Russian economic growth would be higher than the roughly 2%, give or take, that is being predicted for this year and next, had Russia had free access to Western capital. No doubt about that. So that has had an effect. But the greater effect on the slowdown in the Russian economy have been the oil prices that are up, that are down. They've been down lately from the highs of the 2010s and the 20aughts. And that's been the biggest problem. For Putin, the great gift of the sanctions was that he could blame Russia's economic woes on the sanctions temporarily, and also force the Russian elite to reconsider exporting its capital and buying so much property abroad, because there are no guarantees about who's going to end up on sanctions list. And the latest sanctions list that we saw in Washington, D.C. looks like a list of the Forbes magazine of the Russians' most wealthy people. And that's a great way for him to mobilize the support of the elite.
Now, it's interesting because Putin said that falling behind in technology is the main threat and enemy to our country. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, he's absolutely right. And again, this is a consistent theme. This is why Russia has invested so heavily in nanotechnologies. The payoff has not really materialized to a degree where they can justify the investments. But this kind of stuff ends up producing results way down the road. Russia's main problem is not with brains and innovation. A lot of Russians end up going abroad to work in some of the world's best companies, including in California in the United States. The problem is climate for innovation. The problem is courts. The problem is property laws and intellectual property laws. And Russia has a long way to go, but the government is aware of this, but it needs to speed up those reforms.
So what do you think is likely going to drive Russia's growth from this point, and what reforms are still needed?
Court, property rights, definitely, and the court system is first and foremost. Middle and small-sized businesses need to be stimulated and protected from corruption. And corruption ultimately is the biggest problem in Russia. I predict we'll be seeing some high-level arrests and detentions in the next few weeks as the elections approach. The positive aspect of the sanctions, and one of the driving parts of the economy, has been the agricultural sector, which Russia has consistently ignored over 25 years. Until the sanctions were imposed by the West, the Russians imposed the counter-sanctions and started stimulating their domestic market. Agriculture has been one of the fastest growing parts of the Russian economy over the past 4 years. No one would have expected that in 2013.